Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about Boeing. Why Boeing? Well, Boeing is one of America's largest companies. It's also one of the American economy's most important companies. It's critical to national defense. It's critical to the export sector, but it happens to be a company that's not in very good shape right now. And let's talk a little bit about why. So, one of the strange things about the crisis of 2020, the economic crisis of 2020, was that most US companies and industries, large ones anyway, actually did rather well. In fact, you can say the crisis was actually helpful to many sectors and many companies. And you can think about technology, you can think about media, you can think about even agriculture and manufacturing, most manufacturing anyway. So as we've said many times before, in both the pages of Econ Weekly and also in some of the videos that we've done, is that a lot of the economic pain of the 2020 crisis was really concentrated in a very few large industries, large especially in terms of employment, which would be travel, restaurants, leisure, hospitality, things of that nature, anything where you needed to sort of be outdoors. Uh, that now, interestingly enough, is recovering rather quickly uh, to different extents for different companies. But certainly if you're involved in domestic tourism right now, or if you own a restaurant or a bar, chances are you're probably going to have a good summer. It's looking that way. There are problems with access to labor and labor shortages, things like that for sure. But in general, things are on the upswing. Now, there's one company that experienced a horrible 2020 and really isn't enjoying any benefit right now, not really experiencing any of the upswing. And that company is Boeing, which is why they make such an interesting topic of conversation. What's Boeing's situation? Well, it is America's largest exporter, or in normal times, anyway, it is. It just sells these, multi-million-dollar planes to, sometimes orders go well into the billions of dollars all over the world. And of course, it's these are high technology products. They're very high paying jobs for the people who build these planes. So it's critical sector. Now, I should just step back and say for a moment that the export sector in general is a mixed picture. If you look like agricultural exports are doing very well. Pharmaceutical exports doing very well. So even though the global economy is very weak right now, there's not a lot of demand abroad for many U.S. products. There are certain export sectors that are doing very well, certain very big export sectors. Aerospace, unfortunately, is not one of them. And even with the pickup of travel demand, you're not seeing a pickup in meaningful pickup anyway in demand for commercial aircraft. So it really is right now still very much a bleak picture for Boeing. So let's just talk a little bit about Boeing, sort of on the eve of the crisis, what their situation was. So you'll all remember, even if you're not involved in the aerospace industry, everybody sort of the headlines were for a long time just inescapable about the 737 Max. This was a plane that suffered two fatal crashes. There were some software issues, and the plane was just grounded for a very long time. So very difficult situation for Boeing. And difficult situation for airlines too in 2019, 2018, 2019, because of the capacity shortage that this caused in a time of, in most markets, very strong demand. Now, it's almost like the rest of the economy is today, where you had, strong demand and short of supply. Well, the aerospace or the airline industry was experiencing that in 2019 to a certain extent, particularly for the short haul travel that these single aisle 737s are designed to serve. So you had a very difficult situation with managing through that. The planes did start coming back to service before the crisis, but you did have also for Boeing, they did have sort of larger strategic problems with their narrow body aircraft. And when I say narrow body, I'm talking about just the ones that have a single aisle. They're generally used on shorter missions, although they are getting longer. And yeah, typical, if you're in the United States, you would fly them from, they really, their range is very long, so you can fly them across country, but but they're domestic aircraft mostly. Um, can you go across the Atlantic? Yeah, just to a limited extent if you're going from, the northeast of the United States to Iceland or whatever, yes. But in general, they're domestic or short haul aircraft. So Boeing's sort of relatively poor positioning. Um, Only, it's in an understated way. You can't really overemphasize, you can put too much, you don't want to criticize it too much. The 737 was a, excellently selling aircraft, very, very good product in terms of its, commercial capabilities, its economics, very, very strong seller. But there were issues. Airbus was building some products that were, taking some market share from Boeing. Their A321 product, and they also had a product that they obtained through acquisition called the A220, which was starting to pick up steam as well. So there were some worries that Boeing maybe needed to do something with their narrow body product line. Was it a huge strategic problem? No, but it was something they thought about. This NMA, which is kind of a new market aircraft that they were thinking about doing, they ultimately didn't, and they're lucky they didn't because of what happened, with the crisis that ensued afterwards. But Boeing had this problem where their sort of largest narrow body and their smallest wide body left a very big gap in between. So there were some very interesting ideas of building sort of a middle market aircraft. That's another term they use for this, that would have filled that gap nicely and probably would have generated a lot of demand. There was definitely demand in the marketplace for it. Now, whether or not they could have produced it at a cost that airlines would have paid, that's a separate question, but it's really, kind of a moot point right now, at least for the next few years. Uh, Before the crisis, ironically, cargo demand was rather weak. They also had some headaches with this new, very, very large aircraft that they were building called the 777X, which just came in two forms, the 900 and 800. That's now actually still under development. Now, incidentally, not supposed to hit the market until late 2023. So that is, kind of remains a product that Boeing eventually is going to need to start selling because they weren't doing a very good, weren't finding a lot of homes for it before the crisis. And it's a very expensive aircraft too. It required a lot of capital investment. So um, now not as much as an aircraft that was sort of designed from scratch. This aircraft, the 777X, is a derivative aircraft from an earlier 777. So. But still, it's not chump change. It requires a lot of money to put into it. Now, that the reason why airlines weren't too hot on the 777 sort of ties into soft wide body demand in general before the crisis. That had a lot to do with that. There were different factors. Some of it was, in fact, that cargo demand was weak. That was one reason. And there was, some over ordering by airlines in previous years. Now, if you go back to the early 2010s, when we look back at that now, that was kind of the golden years for Boeing and Airbus. They were just selling so many of these wide body planes. And remember, the wide body planes generally have higher profit margins than the narrow body ones. So if you go back to 2012, 2013, sort of coming out a few years coming out of the last crisis, there were certain groups of airlines that were ordering these planes in enormous quantities. And sort of the most spectacular story here was these Gulf carriers in the Middle East, Emirates, Etihad, Qatar Airways. They were just ordering, basically showing up and saying, "Give me, as many of these, of your most expensive products that you have," and they would, be ordering 150 giant 777s or even A380s that Airbus built. Just seemingly every year they would just plop down another order. So this was really like a huge boom for the whole industry, not just the manufacturers themselves, but the whole ecosystem of all the suppliers involved and all the, just anybody. These airlines were just spending so much money. Airports as well in these places were just expanding very fast, a lot of construction underway. China as well. China was for a while very voraciously ordering planes, including the wide bodies. That tailed off, you know, in the couple of years before the crisis, partially because of U.S. tensions. Now, China doesn't really have a choice, too much of a choice when they're buying their aircraft. It's really just Airbus or Boeing. And neither one of those manufacturers by themselves can sort of fulfill all the demand that China was experiencing. So they sort of had to and still have to buy Boeing if they need aircraft. Eventually, they want to get their own homegrown manufacturer to compete, but that's years away, if ever. So Boeing will be in the picture. But the question is, do they need the demand now? China is their domestic market is recovering. So maybe they would need some 737s at some point. But they also have some airlines there that have gone through troubles. Like there's one in particular called Hainan Airlines that overordered. They had to rescale, so some of those planes can be moved around. So there's just not a whole lot of demand coming out of China right now, and that was true before the crisis too. Boeing nearly purchased one of its Brazilian rivals before the crisis, and it called off the deal like in April of 2020, right after the crisis hit. And that was partially to help its cause in the narrow body segment, because Embraer had some smaller narrow body products that could have competed with that A220 I mentioned earlier. There was, despite all those issues, it wasn't really a bad picture for Boeing overall, because they did have just a very, very, very large number of those 737 orders, that narrow body plane, just huge, huge numbers, into the thousands. And this is also the max. When I say 737, it's the max I'm talking about. So it's still, despite even the max's safety issues, it was still very, very much a plane that airlines wanted around the world. And also the 787, even sales did slow down, but it's still a very, very popular airplane. So if we look at Boeing today, just this last quarter, tremendous amount of losses. Now you can see that I circled the red. The red circle there refers to the commercial. That's the the commercial jets that we were just talking about, which in normal times is the largest portion of Boeing's business. Right now, you can see it's $4.3 billion in the first quarter, is considerably lower than their defense business. And the defense business, as you can see, is profitable. Defense is actually, there have been some budget cuts to defense over time, but in general, the military budgets around the world have been pretty steady. So Boeing's been fine there. It's worth emphasizing that Boeing sells not just to the U.S. military, but to allies. Like they recently sold some planes to Australia, for example. So that business holding up well. They also have a services business, which is, you can see, is rather large and rather profitable as well, double-digit operating profit margin last quarter. That's also servicing planes, both military planes and commercial planes. Boeing did, in order to survive the crisis, they did receive a large injection of federal money. They not only got the government money, but their access to private sector money right now, because markets are so liquid. Capital markets are just so, if anybody who needs to borrow, you can just borrow at very low rates, and credit standards are pretty liberal. So you can't. Boeing has as they're bleeding cash for sure, and the balance sheet doesn't look great for sure. But there's at this moment not really any risk of running out of cash. They do have open credit lines and things like that. So what happens if interest rates rise and credit starts drying up? That's a question that's one of poses some risk for sure. There are some lingering engineering issues with some of the 787s, for example, are not getting delivered because of some checks that have to be done. They are starting to win some new 737 orders again post-crisis, particularly from the U.S. airlines. Boeing has I'd say four or five big U.S. customers at Southwest, United, American, Hawaiian, Delta's a customer. Delta's been more of an Airbus customer of late, but they've certainly have bought Boeing planes. And abroad, they've had a few as well. Ryanair is a big Irish carrier that has bought some Boeing 737s as well. But the wide body passenger segment still very much totally dry. Cargo happens to be booming, as you know. There's just the freight business is just great with so many goods moving back and forth across countries that business is booming. So Boeing does sell planes that are just freighters, and that business is doing well, but it's just relatively small. Now, if we look ahead, we have to ask ourselves, is globalization finished, or at least, is that term slowbalization, is it slowing down? Nobody really knows for sure. There definitely are signs of, companies, multinational companies reshoring some of their production. But I think sort of the larger question is whether or not, is business travel, are people going to go, Apple still has, produces all those iPhones in China. Are they still going to be sending, planes full of people, executives over to Chengdu from San Francisco on Boeing 787s? Maybe, but how much of that survives the crisis is sort of a big question. I'm going a little bit out of order here, but obviously most borders are still closed. So, you can't really, if you want to go on vacation right now and you're an American and you want to visit, Australia, you just can't do it right now. So there's, quite questions about that. And then the US-China tensions are very big. Now, Boeing said in its last earnings call that 20% of future aircraft demand is expected to come from China. So if US-China tensions worsen, which they have been in recent years, that doesn't bode well. Now, again, as we mentioned before, China does have limited options. So if they all of a sudden, their airlines see a need for more wide body aircraft or whatever kind of aircraft, then they're not going to be too much choice. And remember too that China and Europe have increasingly tense relations as well. So it's from a Chinese point of view, it'll be sort of a pick your poison kind of, do you order Airbus, Boeing? Chances are you're going to have to order both if demand comes back to where it was 4 or 5 years ago. We don't know though. That a lot depends on the future of international commerce. Environmental pressures is a big one. Now, one reason why airlines, in general, airlines would prefer to fly older planes when fuel prices are cheap, and they are. Fuel prices are kind of back up there now, but they were pretty cheap, and even right now they're relative to back in the mid 2000s, let's say, and even the early 2010s. Fuel prices are rather cheap. So normally, you would be okay with flying older aircraft, but there is a lot of pressure to introduce new technology aircraft because they're environmentally cleaner, and airlines are really trying hard to meet their, carbon reduction goals, because there's just a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure on the aviation segment to do that, and airlines are just very scared that they're going to become like the next tobacco companies, where everybody, consumers kind of shun them, and lawsuits go after them all the time. So environmental pressure is a big thing. A lot of the future environmentalism of the industry depends on the engine manufacturers. Now, Boeing, remember, doesn't make their own engines; they sell the airframes. Companies like General Electric will sell the engines, and customers will buy those separately. And then, go looking further out, there are some new technologies on the horizon. Some companies developing interesting, next generation supersonic aircraft. Will they ever, come to market? It's just hard to say. I mean, they don't expect it in the next 3, 4, or 5 years, at least in any big way. But, when we start to talk about the 2030s, maybe that's true. And even some radical new fuel technology. I mean, batteries, to do an electric plane like you do electric cars, just from, my limited understanding, very, very difficult to do. Just the physics just don't work on these, very large. It would just be, the batteries would just be too heavy for, but there's, you hear about hydrogen planes and I'm sure there's people developing all sorts and then just fuels that are derived from sources other than crude oil, biofuels and things like that, which are still, they never really caught on in a big way because they're still just more expensive than the traditional crude oil based fuel, but that could change over time as well. So just a very brief final slide here. What is the economic impact of a sort of a sick Boeing? But the government would never let Boeing die. I mean, it would just hard to believe that because they're so important in national defense. They're also important, as America's largest exporter. They're important to the trade balance. They're also, they recently laid off something like 40,000 employees, I believe, or I don't know if that was total positions lost or total job cuts. But anyway, it's a very big employer. In terms of regions, Boeing is technically based in Chicago, but most of their engineering facilities are based in Seattle. It's kind of their traditional home. Seattle is going to be just fine because they have Amazon and Microsoft and Costco and Starbucks, and so no problems there. But there are other there are other areas, of the country. Charleston, South Carolina is where they're building all the 787s now. So that area is going to take a hit. Wichita has always been a big aerospace center. There's a company called Spirit Aerosystems, which used to be part of Boeing. They're now independent. They still build a lot of the, they build a big portion of the aircraft. So when the aerospace, when the biggest company in the aerospace industry is down, you'd have to imagine a company like Wichita is struggling right now. Maybe we'll have to do we'll have to feature them in as our place of the week, as we were doing in our Econ Weekly issues. That would be a good one. We'll have to do Wichita one of these weeks. And finally, national defense, as I mentioned, they are so important. So